nuclear weapon, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But he also keeps me up to date in some of the newer law and legal changes in Colorado when it comes to fun stories out of our state with recent drug policy changes there. Always keep me informed, so thank you very much, Mark. He does. But I want to thank you, Annie, for the incredible job that you are doing to fulfilling its mission of preventing a nuclear Iran. I commend all of you for being here and the steadfast efforts that you have provided and promoted. This is an incredibly important mission that UANI has of limiting global business with the Iranian government, the regimes, and the world's foremost violator of human rights, the biggest state sponsor of terror, and for decades, a nation that has built an illicit nuclear program that threatens the United States and our allies. Every global company, and I mean this, every global company should shun this regime as a matter of decent business practices. We're at a critical juncture with Iran. The last administration negotiated a disastrous nuclear deal that enshrined a patient pathway for Iran's nuclear weapons program and provided billions of dollars in sanctions relief to Iran. It destroyed our carefully crafted sanctions program that had been so successful over the past decade of efforts by the United States and the European Union. One of the leaders of the strong U.S. sanctions regime built against Iran, of course, is Senator Mark Kirk, that we talked about a little bit earlier, here with us today, and we'll be speaking to you later this morning. And again, Mark, I want to thank you for your incredible efforts on this front. We know that before President Obama's fateful decision to pursue and finalize the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian economy was on the ropes. The Iranian currency was collapsing rapidly. According to experts, in the first 10 months of 2012, the Iranian currency lost more than 80% of its exchange value. In a single day on October 1st, 2012, it dropped by 15% and after a brief reprieve, resumed its trends downward in early 2013. What happened, you ask, on October 1st, 2012? That was the day that the then Menendez-Kirk sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran went into full effect. According to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, in 2013, Iran's fully accessible foreign currency reserves were down to a mere $20 billion. In 2012 and 2013, the years when international sanctions pressure was at its peak, Iranian economy actually contracted. But today, if you look at World Bank statistics, they say that they expect Iran's growth to rise to 4.2% and 4.6% in 2016 and 2017 as a result of the lifting of the sanctions and a more business-oriented environment. It's indisputable that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which went into effect nearly 13 months ago, left Iran stronger economically and empowered its bad behavior. It turns out that the mullahs didn't spend all their new sanctions windfall on children's hospitals or playgrounds. It's very clear. But it appears they did spend it on weapons of war and support for terrorists. Weapons of war that we just witnessed last week and again this week with an additional launch. As Bloomberg reported on June 6, 2016, Iran's 2017 $19 billion defense budget has increased by 90% from 2016. According to the United Nations Special Envoy on Syria, Iran spends $6 billion a year to support the murderous Assad regime. And since the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has been implemented, Iran has tested ballistic missiles on occasions, most recently this past week, just a few days ago, a direct violations of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1929 and contrary to UN Security Council Resolutions 2231 that enshrined the JCPOA, which prohibits such tests for 8 years. On the Foreign Relations Committee, I spent a tremendous amount of time as chairman of the East Asia Subcommittee dealing with North Korea, trying to figure out a way forward on a peaceful and denuclearized peninsula. But what we saw in the Iran deal was a roadmap for what could have happened, luckily didn't happen, in North Korea. Because what we saw with the Iran deal and the patient pathway that it provides for a nuclear bomb is the fact that if you act bad enough for long enough, you're going to get what you want. North Korea can look at that behavior, continue to test nuclear weapons, continue to develop a missile program, and hope for the same sweetheart deal that Iran got, which would provide a patient pathway to North Korea. The past 8 years, we watched as our policy toward North Korea was one known as strategic patience. Strategic patience toward Iran meant bad behavior is rewarded with something that you want. I'm very glad that North Korea didn't get what it wanted. I'm glad we have a new administration that will not give North Korea the kind of deal that Iran received. But we cannot we cannot let up. We cannot rest. Iran continues to sponsor the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Last week attacked a Saudi frigate, an attack that was probably meant and destined for an American ship. Finally, the intentional humiliation of American soldiers. We all remember that across our TV screens in January of 2016, and the constant harassment of U.S. naval vessels in the Persian Gulf leave us with no doubt that President Obama's Iranian gambit has been a complete failure. The mullah sees America as the great for terrorism and its human rights abuses. As for the future of the nuclear deal, the agreement, I believe the administration must immediately take steps to begin negotiating a better deal, as President Trump promised on the campaign trail. We should make the case clearly to the Europeans, to Chinese, the Russians, that a nuclear Iran a decade or 15 years from now is not in the interest of the international community. We should pursue new initiatives at the United Nations to condemn Iranian behavior and impose additional sanctions for their behavior, and I have great confidence that our new United Nations ambassador, Nikki Haley, will do just that. Most importantly, our new Iran policy must regain the moral clarity that the Iranian regime is a threat to the United States and to our allies, and not a partner for peace and stability in the region. Again, I want to thank UANI for your time this morning and look forward to answering questions that you have.
Who would like to pose a question to the senator? Yes.
Well, thank you. I think one of the most important ways and successful ways that we've seen over the past many decades is the ability to give people information from the outside, whether that's our policy in Iran, the Middle East, or North Korea. If you look at the North Korea sanctions policy the North Korean Sanctions Enhancement Act that we just passed last year, we provided up to over $10 million to develop a program to try to get additional communication into North Korea so that people can see. It's the same principle that we've seen across the world through our broadcast efforts, the same principle that applies in Iran, and I think that's something I'd love to talk to you about, is we can provide a message of peace, a message of opportunity to people who are being used by their state in a way that I believe the vast majority of Iranians would disagree with, but we need to share that with them.
Yes, over here.
Seems like you're in favor of toughening U.S. policy regarding Iran. What about Iran's reaction towards any more toughening of the policy? Because there is no policy per se right now, and it's already flexing its muscles.
Well, I think that's one of the biggest concerns we had over the last several years as we watched Iran continue to violate any number of resolutions of the United Nations, U.S. Policy, and nothing was done. A little slap on the hand here and there, and maybe a sanction or two. But the fact is, we didn't take firm steps toward Iranian illicit behavior. We need to work with our allies. We need to continue to work with European allies, work with our other coalition partners that have been involved in Iranian sanctions to set forward a strong response. And the steps that were put in place, I think we had up to 25 individuals and organizations that were sanctioned on the 3rd of February is a good start. We ought to do more. There are additional steps that we can take, but through our allies and through our firm commitment to our sanctions and our resolutions, we can take these actions, and Iran will have to suffer the consequences as it results to their economy and the measures that impact them.
Are you not concerned about any retaliation, any possible retaliation?
Well, look, I think if we are worried about them launching another missile or something, they're already doing that. If we're worried about their ability to continue to try to develop a nuclear program, they already have the permission under the nuclear deal to do that in just a few years from now. And so I think retaliation is something that they're doing each and every day to mock the deal that they got and to mock all of us for entering into a deal that they got. Look, this is if you look at the nuclear deal, I mean, we're talking about some organizations that were just a few years ago declared to be threats to the financial system around the globe. But yet under the deal, sanctions were lifted against them. They continue to test missiles, ballistic missiles, and in violation of resolutions. And if that's not retaliation, then I don't know what is.
In the back.
Well, I think we have to rebuild the foundation of trust that was damaged when this deal was entered into. Having visited many of our allies, our friends in the Middle East, and heard from them directly their concern with the direction U.S. policy was heading, I think that's where we have to start. We have to continue to rebuild relationships, strengthen our bonds, and convince them that we oppose an Iranian regime that is built on terrorism, that is built on undermining our friends in the region, and that is built on fostering terrorism and unrest among its people. And so building those relationships, building those allies, we can continue to strengthen our sanctions efforts against them and build a coalition of nations that will follow suit.
Yes, back here on the right.
Marie Hart, former State Department spokesman on Fox News about 3 or 4 days ago, said flat out that had the Obama administration not enacted this deal with Iran, that she hinted very strongly that they then would have had a nuclear bomb by now. Meaning, in other words, it was a great deal because they stopped Iran from getting a bomb now. What's the answer to that?
Well, the answer is that this has never been a zero-sum game. I think that's the challenge that we faced during the debate over the Iran deal itself, was the administration was saying, well, it's either war or we do this deal. Well, that was never the question. The question was, how do we work with our allies who, as I talked about, were successfully draining the economy of the resources to develop a nuclear weapon, and that were having a significant impact, and they were just starting to have the impact they needed in order to bring Iran to the negotiating table. And instead, we turned around and gave them a deal that provided billions of dollars sanctions relief and a patient pathway to a nuclear weapon. And so the zero-sum game question is just not a realistic starting place. We should have strengthened the sanctions in the first place and eliminated the nuclear program. What we have now is just a timeout period while they have the global blessing to continue at a later date.
Do we feel they were close?
Do I feel well? You can listen to the testimony and open source statements that they believe that there was perhaps a year or a few years away from developing a warhead with the capability to put it on. But we would have plenty of time at that point to develop diplomatic strengths and powers to bring them to the table for a resolution that did not give them the deal that they got.
Yes, right here in the back.
And remember, too, and the other thing I think that is important to recognize at that point is perhaps it was the New York Times about a month later that was talking about some of the cyber attacks that the United States was poised to carry out on Iran. So at the same time, that would have prevented them from developing a nuclear weapon. So at the same time, you have an administration that is saying, we have no other recourse but this deal. We cannot, they're actually later then had to admit that, yeah, they actually were planning a cyber attack that would have prevented them from developing a nuclear weapon. So the administration was never held to account for that admission. Do I believe they are? Do I believe they are a terrorist? Yes. Yes.
Yes, right here.
My name is Fahma Antalya. I drove all the way from Philadelphia to speak as an American with an Iranian American from two conflicts we've had. One question is regarding Trump's and in terms of being close to Putin and favoring Russia and then having him undermine the relationship they have very close relationship they have with
look, I want to thank you for coming all the way down from Philadelphia. Hope you don't go back in the middle of a snowstorm. I know it was a little bit, in Colorado we could say that's all right, we can handle it. But out here on the East Coast, sometimes it can create a lot of chaos. So wish you a safe trip back home. Look, as I mentioned before in response to a question that was asked, the Iranian people, I believe the vast majority of Iranian people are good people with a great history, a great culture, great education, and great opportunities. That's who the Iranian people are. But they're being led by people who are doing them a great disservice, doing the world great harm. And so when it comes to the first part of your question, which is Trump's relationship with Putin, look, number one, I think we have to be very clear about the United States policy toward Russia, that Russia has opportunities to work with the United States in areas of mutual interest. That's terrorism, that's drug and narcotic trafficking. But there are very clear distinctions between that and areas of our national interest that we cannot ever give up on. National interests of freedom, democracy, human rights, that we must be very firm and resolute. Recognition of international law, what Russia has done with in Ukraine and Crimea is a violation, a flagrant violation of international law. What Russia has done in Syria to basically liquidate Aleppo, continued in the assisting of the 5,000, a little bit less than 5,000 deaths in Syria, civilians at the hands of Russia, is unacceptable. And so while we can work on mutual interests, which could include opportunities to find peace, we cannot ever have a quid pro quo with Russia of, hey, if you find a solution in Syria, we'll give up on sanctions here in Ukraine. That's just not an acceptable outcome. So we have to be firm in our relationships and clear in our policy as it relates to Russia. So again, there are opportunities to show the Iranian people the question about making sure additional voices are heard in Iran. We should do that. We should take advantage of that. But we have to be very clear to the mullahs and those who wish to carry out terrorist attacks against the Middle East, our allies, our interests in the world, and write disparaging comments on ballistic missiles, death to our great allies. That's unacceptable. It's got to stop, and we'll take the necessary measures to do it.
Yes, in the back.
There's been talk for several years about providing Israel with bunker buster bombs, typically MOPs. They could reach down deep to hit the Iranian nuclear sites to increase deterrence because there's a lack of credibility that America would want to enter a war in the Middle East again, which is understandable. But there's Israel more credibility to do so. Do you think that there's political will in Congress now that Trump might sign that Obama previous administration wouldn't have? Do you think there's will in Congress to do something like that?
Well, look, there's no doubt that the will of Israel to act on its best interests. We saw what happened in Syria when they attacked a nuclear facility. Look, I would support that kind of an effort. I think Congress would as well. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me this morning. Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful.
Enjoy the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for being so generous with your time. Our next speaker is a friend and former colleague, the eminent Ambassador John Bolton. I personally saw Ambassador Bolton's commitment and skill on this issue when he served as permanent representative to the United Nations. He previously served in numerous senior State Department roles, too numerous to mention, and currently serves as a senior fellow at AEI and as a senior advisor to UANI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristen. It's a great pleasure to be here with Steve and Mark and Senator Gardner. Thanks so much to him for leading off today. Thanks to all of you for coming. Obviously, this question of what to do in the Trump administration about Iran and its, in my view, ongoing nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs obviously is could not be a timelier topic. And I think as events have unfolded in just the past 3 weeks, we can see that we are approaching a very potentially dispositive point on Iran and its program. I'd love to go through the history, some of which Senator Gardner has covered, but I won't because I think we really only have time to look ahead. And so the issue that we have as of now not necessarily supplied as might have followed from a comprehensive strategy, but where we are now is that just within the past week, the National Security Advisor of the United States has said Iran is on notice about its behavior in failing to comply with the Vienna deal of the summer of 2015. A lot of people said, well, what does on notice mean? Let me give you my interpretation of what on notice means. I think it means that the JCPOA is about one heartbeat away from disappearing. That's what on notice means. I can tell you in my own experience that sometimes it's hard for people to get a message like that. My first job in the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, was negotiating the end of the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty so that we could build a national missile defense system in this country. And to try and convince the Russians we were serious, at one point in one of our sessions, I said to them, you know, you view the ABM treaty as a perpetual treaty with a 6-month provision for withdrawal. You give notice to withdraw, you wait 6 months, and then you withdraw. I said, I don't see it that way. I see the ABM treaty as a 6-month treaty that we're renewing day by day. So let me put it this way in connection with the Iran nuclear deal. This is a one-day agreement that we're renewing day by day. And it's that close to disappearing entirely. And I think with good reason. I don't think the Ayatollahs ever had any intention of complying other than cosmetically with the requirements imposed on them by the deal. I think their nuclear weapons program continues in venues that we know little or nothing about. I think their ballistic missile program continues in full view of the entire world. And despite their stated objective that it's to launch weather and communication satellites, it's obviously a program designed to create delivery vehicles for nuclear weapons. So when the Pentagon said with respect to the missile test of about 10 days ago that they believed that it failed on reentry, just think about that for a minute. If you're trying to launch weather and communication satellites, you don't have to worry about reentry. The goal is to put them in orbit and keep them there. You worry about reentry when you want a reentry vehicle that can deliver a nuclear weapon. And it's no surprise that for these past 25 to 30 years, North Korea and the regime in Tehran have cooperated on their ballistic missile programs. They both use Scud technology from the Soviet era. They both intend these programs for the same function. And Iran was a convenient partner for North Korea when the North Koreans had a moratorium on launch testing from the peninsula beginning in 1998, lasting until 2006. There's every reason to believe there's cooperation on nuclear issues as well. So even if we had faith that the IAEA could monitor the aspects of the Iranian program they're charged to do under the JCPOA, we have no idea about what activity is transpiring in places in Iran that we have not been able to detect yet. And that's been the history of the Iranian program over the past 15 years, that they hide their activity until somebody makes it public, like the MEK or U.S. intelligence finds it out, and then they admit to it and say, well, you know, we intended to declare it to the IAEA in due course, and just in the preliminary stages, and it's a technical problem, and so on and so forth. So whatever else is out there that we don't know about, I'm sure is cranking away. And I think it's entirely possible that the North Korean-Iranian connection is much closer than we know about, and that some of Iran's illicit nuclear activity is being carried out under mountains in North Korea, where our intelligence is wretched. I think that's one of the lessons Tehran learned with the Israeli destruction of the reactor in Syria in September of 2007. When you want to carry out activities far from prying eyes, you carry it out in a country that's where you think nobody's looking. They thought back then nobody was looking in Syria. Thank God the Israelis were. We didn't see it. We didn't detect it. But obviously, with the failure in Syria, I think the Iranians are intending to go somewhere else, and that could well be North Korea. So what is it in the face of this 30-year-long effort to achieve deliverable nuclear weapons that we should look at now with the accord on life support as it is? Look, I would have ripped it up in the early days of the administration. The deal was a strategic mistake for the United States. It's not getting any better with age. A clear, unambiguous political statement that the deal is unacceptable, I think would have been the strongest way to go. But we're getting very close to that point as it is. Let's face it, it's the way this deal was negotiated. It was designed by the Ayatollahs and by the Perm 5 plus Germany to make it almost impossible to reimpose economic sanctions. The assets that were frozen are gone. The sanctions themselves imposed as a result of Security Council resolutions are going to be difficult, if not impossible, for the Europeans to stomach again. And the regime in Tehran knew that from the get-go. That was the point. Relieve the burdens on Iran at the front end, get the Europeans especially enmeshed in economic deals and trade and investment to provide a lobby in those countries against reimposing the sanctions, with the heavy burden of Iran's compliance obligations to follow down the road, which they're not going to comply with in any event. So I think we've got diplomatically, it's very difficult to envision multilateral sanctions being effective again in the short term. And I think that even if we were to lay out the intelligence that I believe could be found if we look for it hard enough of Iranian violations other than what we know of already, we have to acknowledge that in the wake of the allegations about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that we've got a heavier burden of persuasion on coalition partners than we would have had before. I think the path to make it impossible for Iran to get nuclear weapons economically is now nearly out of the question. And because the regime is close enough, after all these years of effort to getting that nuclear device in production, I think you've got to look at other alternatives. And I think we've got to be blunt about it. People say they don't want the Iranian regime to get nuclear weapons. And then you talk about some of the hard steps that we're going to need to confront, and they say, well, we don't really want to do that. Implicitly, the conclusion that one has to draw is you're content to have an Iran with nuclear weapons. And if you really don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons, then you got to sort of suck your breath in and say, okay, what are the alternatives out there? If you don't like the conduct of the regime today, imagine what the conduct of the regime is going to be once they have that capability. So my view for quite some time, and it hasn't changed, and recent conduct hasn't lessened my concern. My view is that it should be declared American policy to overturn the regime in Tehran, because that is the only way, ultimately, that you will get Iran to back off the pursuit of nuclear weapons. The opposition, I think, understands that this puts Iran in more danger, ultimately, than provides them security. I think that the role of Iran as the central banker for international terrorism ever since 1979 alone is compelling reason to remove them as the source of the problem in the Middle East. You look at the carnage that we've seen in Syria for 6 years. Why has the Assad regime survived? Because of the support of the Revolutionary Guards Corps directly to Assad and through Hezbollah, aided by the Russians. This unholy coalition has devastated Syria and with no sign that it's letting up. New Russian rocket deliveries in Tartus reported over the past few days. So this is a regime that's not alone responsible for instability and threats to peace in the Middle East, but which is the principal threat, and with a nuclear capability would be a worldwide threat. Any regime that arms and supplies terrorists is perfectly capable of giving a nuclear device to a terrorist group. And those of you who know your nuclear forensics know that even our experts worry that a nuclear device delivered by a tramp steamer or some other way other than a ballistic missile may be very hard to determine the origins of it. It's one thing to do a back azimuth on a ballistic missile that hits your territory because you can figure out where it came from. But if a nuclear device goes off and our experts say, we're 75% sure it came from Iran, what's your retaliation then? And where's your deterrence capability if you don't believe you can fully understand where the missiles come from? So I think this regime should be the subject of American policy to remove it. And I think if that fails and you can't turn this on and off like a light switch, I don't think it requires American military involvement. I think it requires support for the opposition. I think the regime is unpopular. The fact is it has the guns and they know it. But it takes time. It takes time. Congress appropriated funds for both clandestine and overt steps to remove the Iranian regime. And under Republican and Democratic administrations, the funds simply weren't spent. So we've wasted a lot of time, and there may not be enough time to get regime change before the Ayatollahs get a nuclear capability, which is why if you seriously believe that you don't want an Iran with nuclear weapons, you have to contemplate the use of military force to prevent that. Now, Israel has already twice in its history used military force for precisely that purpose. Successfully against Saddam Hussein in 1981 and against the reactor in Syria in September of 2007. Nobody says this is an attractive alternative. Nobody's looking to find a way to do it. If there were any other way, which we have tried to prevent the Ayatollahs from getting nuclear weapons, then there would be an argument against the use of force. But we are just about out of time, and we have tried every other possibility. So remember that the comparison we're making here is not between the world as it is today compared to the world after a strike against Iran's nuclear program. It's the world as it will be when Iran has nuclear weapons compared to the world after a strike against the program. And on those terms, if you're really worried about Iran getting nuclear weapons, the cost-benefit analysis is very different. And I think there's a broader global conclusion here as well. North Korea has exploded 5 nuclear devices. Our commander of U.S. Forces Korea and the South Korean military have both estimated that possibly by early next year, North Korea will have the capability to deliver weapons to the west coast of the United States. North Korea can do it. The Ayatollahs will not be far behind, because in at least one scenario, they could simply buy them from the North Koreans, thanks to the lifting of sanctions and the selling of Iranian oil on open markets. This is a prospect that when you look at North Korea, which will sell anything to anybody for hard currency, you look at Iran getting deliverable nuclear weapons, it tells every other country in the world that may want it. With a little bit of patience, you too can overcome the opposition of the United States and the rest of the civilized world. You too can have nuclear weapons. We have every reason to believe that Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey are already pursuing indigenous nuclear weapons programs. This Vienna deal has helped bring a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, because those countries aren't going to wait around to see what the inevitable outcome is. I just think that rather than talking again about the imposition of sanctions and hoping that they're going to work, the deal has been a mistake. It needs to be abrogated or eliminated. Maybe the Iranians will do it for us. Maybe if we designate the Revolutionary Guards Corps as a terrorist organization, which should have happened about 10 years ago, maybe the Iranians will throw up their arms and say it's an outrage. We're withdrawing from the agreement. Great. Then we're in exactly the right place. But it's not going to be an easy task to stop them from getting nuclear weapons. If you're really indifferent to an Iran with nuclear weapons, if you think it's not a problem, then there's no need to contemplate the harder steps. But if you're worried about what the world is in the future when one country after another gets this capability, If we don't see the line drawn here, then there will be no line, and it's just that simple. Thank you very much.
I have the first follow-up, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. What do you think the most likely scenario leading to the collapse of the deal is? Is the administration heading there already and just sort of getting its ducks in a row? Do you think a particular provocation pushes them out? Or as you say, do you think actually Iran pulls out the deal in response to some action here?
Well, I don't know what the sort of broad political plan is that the administration has, but I don't think it was accidental or just on the spur of the moment that Mike Flynn made the comment about Iran being on notice. I think that's as clear a signal as you can get that the administration understands what the game is, and I think the sanctions were intended to send a signal. I don't believe in targeted sanctions. I think when you sanction the ABC company, the next thing that happens is that the CDE company springs up, and that they do the business that the ABC company did before. I favor every sanction we can get against the regime, but I don't think they're going to step out unless there's something much more dramatic, like, for example, designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization. I would prefer that the United States make a clear and unambiguous break itself, because I think we have to make the case why, after a year and a half, we're reversing the deal. I understand this is a dramatic change, but for goodness sakes, if your policy is fundamentally flawed, dangerous to your country and your allies, there are any number of good and sufficient reasons to reverse course before the damage becomes palpable. And so I would prefer to do it that way, but the Iranians may solve that problem, and it would not be something that we haven't seen before, but it is the kind of thing that would help clarify the position.
Yes, in the back.
I'm not sure how many inspections did the Obama administration do on the Iranians after the agreement? I think I know the answer. And should the Trump administration start, kind of, we want an inspection, be a sort of a forcing function to, get the Iranians to throw up their hands, and also to put us in a better high ground position?
Yeah. Did everybody hear that question? Because I just got the microphone at the end. What kinds of inspections have we seen? Look, I'm a big supporter of the International Atomic Energy Agency. I think it does very good work, but it's not a spy agency. It monitors the non-diversion of nuclear material from declared nuclear facilities, okay? And so we've got declared or found out nuclear facilities in Iran that the IAEA is monitoring, has certain other limited tasks that the Vienna deal has assigned to it. It's not capable alone of preventing violations of the deal. Much of what the IAEA puts out on the public record about suspected nuclear activity in countries around the world is material that we or other countries give to them, and then allow the IAEA to prove it out or to force the other country to refute it. So the best of goodwill for the IAEA isn't going to accomplish the task. And I think one of the things that I hope President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu discuss next week is, again, making sure we've got fully a shared intelligence on Iranian violations and a discussion of what we feel we can make public without blowing sources and methods we may need further down the road. I'm just worried that even with the intelligence we have, the black hole of what happens in North Korea, if the Iranians, having found you can't finance a reactor in Syria, decided to finance activities in North Korea, our chances of determining that are close to zero under present circumstances.
It's here in the red.
Hang on, here comes the microphone.
Just wondering, why do you suppose that the Trump administration didn't rip up the deal day one?
Well, I don't know, other than they had a lot of things to do. You know, he never said that he would do that. Other candidates for the Republican nomination basically did say it would be in the inaugural address that they were tearing it up. They didn't get the nomination. I don't know how you could be clearer, though, than candidate Trump about his view on the deal, as Senator Gardner said. Positions he has repeated during the transition and even after the inauguration. So my guess is, and it's just a guess, that inside the administration they're considering what the best way to go about it is and hearing different points of view. Subjects that I rather doubt were discussed in the heat of the campaign. And so obviously in this extraordinarily dangerous area, you want the decisions to be considered, and it doesn't bother me. I don't detect any sign that suddenly they're warming to the deal and thinking, it's really not a bad deal. We can learn to live with this. You can't enforce this deal, as some have suggested. I wrote in the Wall Street Journal on Monday, it's like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. It's just a badly written deal. I mean, God forbid, I've actually read it all. I'm sure a couple others in here have read it all too. I'd be embarrassed to say I negotiated that deal. At least I'd be embarrassed as the representative of the United States to say it, because there are so many loopholes in it. And it's just a further reason why it's unworkable even under the best of circumstances. So where do I think the Trump administration is going? I think they're going in the right direction, but I think they're taking it in a slow and responsible fashion. I don't have any problem with it. As I say, I would have done it differently, but I don't think the overall direction bothers me at all.
Here in the front. Yes, there should be a mic.
Well, everybody needs to hear the question, so.
Hi, Ambassador Joyce Karam with the Al Hayat newspaper. I'm not sure if you read the Washington Post. There is genuine fear that Iran is now more powerful.
I do read it every once in a while, I have to say.
That's good. There is genuine fear that Iran is, at this point, more powerful than ever before in the region. A risk of Iran retaliating, either at the GCC countries or in Iraq against U.S. troops, from Syria at Israel or in Lebanon. How much would you be poking the regional bear, kind of, if you escalate too much, and how much do you worry about a full regional war at this point?
Well, look at what Iran is doing now. Engaged in the Syrian civil war through Hezbollah and through direct involvement with the Assad regime. Look at the activity they've engaged in the, I'll call it the Persian Gulf, just to be benign to them, but in the Gulf, in the Red Sea. Look at their seizure of American sailors. Look at their continuing support for terrorism. They're already at a high operations tempo, as they say in the military, of unacceptable conduct. And when you add to that the continued progress they're making on the nuclear and ballistic missile program, you have to say, if this is what they're doing now, and you say, well, don't poke the bear now, how are you going to poke the bear when it has nuclear weapons? So, it's not anything, an escalation of direct confrontation is not anything anybody wants to contemplate, but for the fact they're close to getting nuclear weapons. If we were 15 years ago, it would have been a lot less potentially difficult. But tomorrow is going to be worse than today. And the day after that is going to be worse than tomorrow, and on until finally they're not racing. And this was an answer to a question earlier, I think. They're not racing to build one nuclear weapon. They're building a large, comprehensive nuclear infrastructure, and the day they announce they've got a nuclear weapon, they won't have one, they'll have several dozen. So that's what we're trying to head off here. And my belief is that Israel and the Arab governments of the region fully understand the danger. And I think their views about complying with the JCPOA that Saudi Arabia and others articulated were consistent with Barack Obama being president. He's gone now. There's a new sheriff in town. And I believe that a lot of the states that were content in the prior political circumstance to live with the deal are now prepared to change.
Yes, in the back.
Since the previous sanctions did seem to be having an effect, as the other speaker told us, why do you think Obama pushed so hard for this deal? It almost seemed like he was obsessed to get a deal before he left office. Do you have any insight as to why you think he actually pushed so hard?
Well, I think it's his misbegotten worldview, and it would only take me about 6 days to explain what I think is wrong with it. So rather than looking backward, I think the consequences are apparent, and the result has not been an increase in peace and security in the Middle East. The region is now more endangered. And the possibility of broader conflict is greater and grows greater daily as not only Iran makes progress toward nuclear weapons, but as other states in response, this is what we mean by proliferation, in response to the Iranian program, are going to develop their own. So, you know, I am not one who believes that the world is a better place if more countries get nuclear weapons. And the line I'm prepared to try and draw it in is Iran.
The woman in the back.
Thanks. Alexa Van Ann, you've already spoken about some of the diplomatic and economic tools that we have to push back against Iran. However, some of the examples that you hold out about gains that Israel or the U.S. has made have been cyber operations. So can you speak to the role of cyber in pushing back against Iran?
Well, I can talk about some things that are public knowledge, and I think there are things that have been undertaken against the Iranian program in cyber activity and several others, and I think they have had the consequence of slowing the program down somewhat. But we've also seen Iran time and time again, when information that they thought they had concealed becomes public, of tightening their communication security. And when they found these viruses that were unleashed against the program, of dealing with them and redoing their information technology infrastructure in ways that protect against it. I'm not saying we shouldn't continue to use whatever steps are available. I just think we have to be realistic. Those are palliatives in a sense. They can mitigate the downside. They can slow down the program, but they alone can't stop it. And that's the problem that we're confronting.
Yes, this gentleman.
Ambassador, I'm going to answer the question that the gentleman in the back asked you, why the Obama administration pushed so hard in order to get that deal. Have you ever looked into Valerie Jarrett's position in the White House, who was born in Iran, had some colleagues, peers, and Mohammad Bagher Namazi, and Tarita Parsi, the lobbyist in the White House. You have to look into Valerie Jarrett's resume. She was the instrumental person in order to get that deal and dealing with the Iranian regime, which is being so hated by all Iranians, most of them.
Okay, can you ask me a question now?
Is there, sir, is there?
No, I don't have any question.
Okay. Okay. Well, then let me just take the opportunity to answer. I mean, I'm afraid the real reason is that Barack Obama went to Columbia and Harvard Law School and listened to what the faculty told him. That's the.
Can I just ask one more? Were the sanctions when they were
Sir,
working?
hold on. I just want to make sure. Let's let this gentleman ask this question.
Thank you. Michael Lippin with Voice of America Persian. Ambassador, what military steps do you think the Trump administration might consider to pressure Iran to give up its nuclear ambitions, short of going to war?
Well, look, just to be clear, I don't speak for the Trump administration. I can tell you what I think is necessary, and I think that if there truly were a credible threat of military force, I mean a really credible threat, that alone might be sufficient to get that the only thing other than the actual use of military force. And people have talked about a credible military threat, and the president had a button on his speechwriter's typewriter where it put in all options are on the table. And he'd say it about the same way, all options are on the table. Nobody believed him. Nobody believed that Barack Obama was going to use military force, that he ever thought it was possible to use military force against the Iranian program. Anybody needed any proof, they just watched the red line speech about the chemical weapons in Syria. And it dispelled any notion that there was a credible threat. So Donald Trump has credibility 3 weeks into office. It's possible that he could convince Iran that he was prepared, perhaps together with Israel, perhaps aiding Israel, perhaps unilaterally, that would be serious enough that Iran would back away. I don't know whether he will do that or not, and honestly, I don't know whether the regime would believe him, because I'm not sure they believe anything anymore about what we say, having watched 15 years of talking about it. I think they've learned the lesson of North Korea, at least that's what I fear, that signed the agreed framework in the 1990s and violated it before the ink was dry and was proceeding to nuclear weapons and then got to nuclear weapons while we were still talking with them. So I think, as President Rouhani himself said in an article in Farsi after he stopped being the chief nuclear negotiator in 2005, that he used the negotiations and the regime used the negotiations to delay, to give the regime time. Time is always on the side of the proliferator. The more time that goes by, the more the situation deteriorates.
Can you take one more?
Sure.
Last question? Last question.
Oh, I just wanted to know, is there any way that the Trump administration could make Iran see a credible threat?
I'm not sure what it would be other than a demonstration use of force somewhere, and I'm not sure that's worth the risk, that it wouldn't provoke some other conflict that would be harmful in the Gulf region. I have always imagined that if there were the possibility of using military force against Iran's program, it would look very much like what Israel did in 2007 and before that in 1981. Very surgical. And very limited. Now, Iran's program is more dispersed, but it still has some particularly vulnerable points, some choke points. It's not just uranium enrichment. It's the conversion of uranium from a solid to a gas, from U308 to UF6 at Esfahan, which is all above ground. Be very easy. And once you cut that choke point off, there's no more uranium available for enrichment. The danger, of course, is that we have let so much time go by that there are any number of facilities that we simply don't know about in Iran, so that we could destroy those we know about, even those at Qum that are deeply buried, and we still wouldn't close the program down. I'd nonetheless be prepared to take that risk than see the program proceed unimpeded, which is the course we're on now. Thank you very much.
Great, well, wonderful. Well, we have an excellent panel discussion to wrap up today. I couldn't be more pleased with the people we have here to talk. First, Senator Mark Kirk, who served in the Senate from Illinois, and before that in the House, and in both chambers, there wasn't anyone more active or committed on this topic than Senator Kirk. So there, anyway, is incredible sort of expertise and moral authority to talk about the topic in front of us today. And then my former colleague, Steve Rademaker, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation. He has over 20 years of experience on national security issues in multiple branches of government and played a key role in the Bush administration on this precise issue. So thank you both for being here today. Ambassador Bolton just told us that he thinks the deal is sort of a heartbeat away from imploding, and I'm curious whether you both think that's true. And I guess one question I have is when we watch the confirmation hearings, actually General Mattis seemed to be making the point that we're sort of stuck with the deal. We might not like it, but we're going to have to live with it. And so I'm just wondering if you share Ambassador Bolton's view that this deal's about to expire, whether you think that's a that's an open question. Senator, can you?
Let me offer two ideas that I would offer if I was sitting in Mike Flynn's office, because I used to work for him as a reservist in the JCS J2.
Yeah.
That for the policy going forward, I think we got to find high impact, no military options for the Trump administration. The two options that seem best to me is to rely on legislators to redefine the fiduciary responsibility as not including anything in Iran. And we've got a number of states that have also signed on with us to oppose the divest DBS movement. Because I think with Illinois and Iowa, we could redefine a good fiduciary as someone who had no investments in Iran. And to give a quasi-military option, I went to the Israelis and I asked them if there's a way that the United States Navy could resupply Israeli submarines in the Indian Ocean. And when I tried to embarrass the Israelis into this policy, I asked their chief of naval operations, whose nickname is Chinese, because he looks a little bit Oriental. I said, Chinese, question. How many diesel-electric submarines did Hitler have in the Indian Ocean in the World War II? Answer: 45. So if Hitler could do it, then you could put some diesel-electric submarines in the Indian Ocean. I said, Chinese, the way this works, all you need to do is have one submarine surface within sight of the entrance of the Persian Gulf, because we know with submarines, if they're sighted someplace there, it's as if they're permanently there. That would give Israel a tremendous military option. And I think U.S. diplomacy would be enhanced knowing there was potentially an Israeli subsurface option right outside the Persian Gulf.
Is Mickey here? I thought Mickey Edelstein, I think the Israeli defense attaché, I think attaché is coming soon, so I hope he heard your, yeah.
But I would tell you the Israelis didn't like this idea.
Pretty.
They got to think of every option. And the thought is, oh gosh, Mark, what if one of our diesel electrics had an engine failure? Then we would have an Israeli.
There he is. Sorry.
And we would have.
Are you listening?
We would have an Israeli submarine wash up on the coast of Somalia, where the crew would be wiped out, and we have a couple $100 million in garbage there. I kind of understood that point. So I didn't want to push them into a risk profile that they were not comfortable with. I remember just before Bibi became prime minister, they did transit the nuclear fleet of Israel through the Suez Canal, and obviously everybody noticed. And I think that would be good cooperation between the two countries. United States could easily resupply Israeli submarines in the deep ocean. In the Indian Ocean, to make sure no engine failures, full fuel, make sure nobody had even a chance of washing up an Indian Ocean shoreline there.
Steve, what do you think?
Well, we heard John Bolton say a few minutes ago that, in his opinion, the agreement's on life support, and I agree with that, actually. I think the first point to bear in mind is that we had a debate in the United States on this agreement, and this was almost 2 years ago now. As a legal matter, and I'm a lawyer, as a legal matter, the president got what he wanted. He got a green light to proceed with the agreement. But that was only because the mechanism for the review required a 2/3 vote to disapprove in both houses, which is a very high threshold. As part of that debate, members of Congress debated this agreement on its merits. And on its merits, it's crystal clear, the United States Congress, and they're the representatives of the American people, the United States Congress, on the merits, decided this was a bad deal. A majority of both houses was opposed to the deal. Every single Republican in both houses voted no, and a surprisingly large number of Democrats in both houses also voted no. And in doing that, they were standing up to pretty strong political pressure brought to bear upon them by the administration. Obama's strategy, which ultimately succeeded as a legal matter, was to basically turn this into a partisan issue and go to Democrats and say, whether you like this deal or not, as a loyal Democrat and as somebody who wants to see me succeed as president, you need to vote yes on this deal. And Most Democrats went along with that, but not all of them, and including some pretty important ones. Chuck Schumer, who's today the minority leader here in the Senate, Ben Cardin, who's the ranking Democrat at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Elliot Engel, who's the ranking Democrat at the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So some pretty significant Democrats withstood that political pressure and still voted no. I guess my first point is the political consensus in Washington in support of this deal has always been razor thin. And it was really the position of the Obama administration, their deep devotion to this agreement that first got it approved. And then and here's my second point, it was their, I'd say it was almost irrational commitment to this agreement that has kept it alive for the last year and a half. And by that I mean, I think if you look at the details of implementation, what you'll see is that there was, over the last year and a half, there's been a pretty consistent pattern of undercompliance by Iran. And every time this undercompliance has been noticed, the Obama administration bent over backwards to sweep it under the carpet, explain it away, buy it away. I mean, the two best examples, and I'll just cite two of them, the two best examples of this are first, the agreement is crystal clear about how much heavy water Iran is able to possess. It says they're allowed to have 130 metric tons of heavy water. Twice now, since the agreement came into force, the IAEA has determined that they exceeded that, and they were just overproducing. This is not this is not an argument among lawyers about interpretation. I mean, this is just crystal clear. They violated a clear term of the agreement. What was the Obama administration reaction? Did they denounce the Iranians for violation? Did they seek to hold them accountable? No, not at all. They got out their checkbook. In the first instance, they wrote a check for, I think it was $8.3 million to the Iranians to buy the excess heavy water. So I mean, they were just using checkbook diplomacy to paper over, I would argue, to facilitate Iranian noncompliance with the agreement. It happened again in November, and now it's since emerged, in addition to spending taxpayer money to help Iran, help Iran. I mean, no one, for some reason, they never asked Iran to restrain its heavy water production. That would be the simplest way for them to remain in compliance with the agreement. The Obama administration didn't ask them to restrain their heavy water production. Instead, they paid them cash to buy from them the excess heavy water. And it also has since emerged that in addition to cash, part of the payment was the transfer to Iran of natural uranium, about 130 tons of natural uranium. So, a very complex transaction, all designed to paper over Iranian noncompliance. The other one, the other example, has been in the news more recently, and that's Iran's missile development and their testing of missiles. When you go back and look at the record, what the Obama administration represented to the Congress and the American people about what would be permitted under this agreement, they were very clear that missile testing would remain prohibited for the first 8 years of the agreement. Secretary Kerry testified there would be no change. Yes, the Security Council would be adopting a new resolution, but he said that that new resolution would carry forward the restrictions that had existed, the prohibition. The UN Security Council imposed prohibition on ballistic missile testing by Iran that had existed previously. Well, pretty quickly after the entry into force of the JCPOA, Iran started testing ballistic missiles. And initially, the Obama administration said, yeah, that's a violation. We didn't, and they denounced it. But they did in the early phases apply some of these entity-specific sanctions, very similar to what the Trump administration announced last week in response to another Iranian missile test. And I'm all in favor of those sanctions, but let's be clear, they're just sort of a slap on the wrist because they're targeted against individuals and entities that have no connection to the United States and are completely immune to any practical impact of these sanctions. But what was interesting was that very quickly the lawyers got into it, and upon looking, putting the new UN Security Council resolution under the microscope, the Obama administration determined, well, in fact, maybe it wasn't a violation. And they basically then erected themselves as Iran's lawyers, notwithstanding what Secretary Kerry had represented to the Congress, they then argued, well, actually, the rules did change, and the new Security Council resolution is designed to discourage discourage Iran from testing, but doesn't prohibit. And
Although
that was their
looks like-
position.
It looks like the Trump lawyers have reversed on that
Yeah.
because the Flynn statement last week said this is a clear violation of 2231. And that was where they used this language saying that Iran was on notice.
Right.
And I'm curious how both of you interpret that language. It looks to me like it was deliberately ambiguous about, and so I'm wondering, do you interpret it the way Ambassador Bolton does, on notice that we're out of here, or do you think there was something, they had something else in mind? Senator?
I would say that the most important thing I'm going to follow with Steve on is defense of the American people. When I was the chair of the Military Construction Subcommittee here before recent election defeat, I was very focused on finishing 2 United States missile defense sites. One in Regikovo, Poland, another in Devashulu, Romania. If you take a piece of yarn from eastern Iran and point it towards New York City, which would be the likely missile flight path of a long-range missile from Iran against the United States, it has to pass over both Devashulu and Regikovo. The important thing to now is to make sure the Devashulu site, which has come online, is fully capable of knocking down an extra-atmospheric target to make sure the American people can rest easy against a very long-range missile. But I would say you get out of all of the lawyer arguments. The best thing that the Trump administration can do is to declassify the entire agreement and publish it so that the Congress and the American people can look at it and see the negotiating record and understand all of the terms as they were put forward before the parties.
It's a very important point. Steve?
So, I guess the first thing I'd say about that statement by General Flynn is, as a candidate, Donald Trump had promised that as president in the conduct of his foreign policy, he was going to be unpredictable. And I think General Flynn came up with a statement that shows what a declared policy of unpredictability looks like, because I think no one knows for sure what on notice means, but there are many possible interpretations. And I guess the one that's most obvious to me is that what they were saying, what the administration is saying, is that this policy of overlooking noncompliance or undercompliance by Iran is at an end. That under this administration, the intention is to hold Iran to the obligation at a minimum. Now, it may be that they intend to go further than this, but I would say at a minimum, they no longer intend to overlook undercompliance by Iran. I didn't make my further point earlier, but coupled with tolerance for undercompliance, what the Obama administration did was overcomplied when it came to the performance of our obligations under the agreement. And they did a number of things to provide significantly more sanctions relief and financial benefits to Iran under the deal than they were required to provide under the letter of the agreement. So I'd say the second thing putting them on notice means is that Iran cannot look forward to further overcompliance by the United States with its obligations under the JCPOA.
And what are your thoughts, both of you, on the question that came up earlier about designating the IRGC as a terrorist entity? What are the implications of that? Good idea, bad idea?
Very good idea, because we know the IRGC operates huge industrial combines, and that could help you reach a number of to the level of third-party sanctions and make sure that set of economic entities had nothing to do with the $17 trillion U.S. economy, which is the largest on earth. It's a good idea to defund the Iranians. Very good idea. I think we could expand on that, and I think going further with regime change, which Ambassador Bolton talked about, a policy of knocking them out of the SWIFT system to make sure the Iranian currency is more and more unusable. Menendez-Kirk almost brought them to their knees. I joked that Iran was so out of money they might have missed a payment or two to Hezbollah. If everybody can take a quick look, I passed out this sheet, which is very useful in the Senate, which I know well. The hundreds of Americans have been murdered by Iranian-sponsored terror, broken out by state. This is 40 different states here showing everybody. If you talk to somebody, senator representing these states, and this will be the most effective way to talk about enhancing the safety and security of the American people against Iranian terror proxies. I hope you'll take that home with you.
And Jason, we have some more of those in the back. Is that right? I think, yes, I think there are some more. Yeah. Steve, what are your thoughts about?
Well, to designate someone as a terrorist entity, this is not a name that we call people. It's not a feel-good thing that we do. It's something that's to be done. It's sort of a legal judgment that an individual or an entity has supported terrorism. And I think the unfortunate point for the IRGC is that I think we sustained almost 4,500 Americans killed in Iraq and almost 32,000 wounded. Iranian-provided IEDs had a lot to do with many of those casualties. I think if you've looked at who President Trump has put in his senior national security positions, a lot of them are ex-military. Most of them served in Iraq. I think they feel very personally and very keenly the consequences of what the IRGC has done. And so, I think as they evaluate the legal standard and compare that to the behavior of the IRGC, we probably are headed toward a designation.
And how would this impact particularly European businesses? Obviously, the IRGC runs this sprawling business enterprise with lots of front companies, and we can presume there are lots of Western companies doing business with front companies without knowing that. So how would you see this sort of playing out if we go in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, the complicating factor, of course, is the IRGC in Iran is more than just the army. I mean, it runs large portions of the economy, which means a lot of a lot of Iranian business enterprises are IRGC controlled. So, yeah, it would be a serious complication for conducting business.
I wanted to turn to some of the regional questions which came up earlier, but one particularly important one strikes me as this Iranian-Russian alliance. There was a report that the Trump administration tends to take actions to try to break up, but obviously, that's an enormously complicated effort. So I'm wondering, do you think they have any chance of succeeding in that, and what would that look like? How would we disrupt?
I'll say that low probability of with the delivery of the SA-10 to Iran, that was the chief objective of the Bush administration, to make sure that contract was not fulfilled. That I've been thinking about ways to interact with Russia. Probably the best way to do it is to lift the embargo on the export of U.S. LNG. And if U.S. LNG can be delivered directly to parties like Ukraine and make sure people are increasingly independent of Russia, that weapon can be effectively used in the Putin and Trump dialogue to make sure that U.S. LNG tankers are meeting Western European gas needs. Gives us a lot of leverage.
Well, I think the Trump administration has some hard choices to be made in Syria. They've not been dealt a very good hand, or I guess I should say they were not left a very good hand by the Obama administration. We all wish there were some third option, a pro-democratic, moderate force in Iran, or I'm sorry, in Syria that we could work with. But there's very little of that left as of today. I mean, even Turkey, which has supported those forces in the past, seems to have backed away, and they're cutting their deal. They appear to be cutting their deal with the Russians and the Iranians. Essentially, what's going on the ground in Syria today is the ground forces are in large measure Iranian supplied. The air forces are largely Russian supplied. I don't know how, and it's a formula that's working. They're beating the rebels on all fronts. How one could persuade the Russians and the Iranians that it's no longer in their interest to work together in Syria when they today have a winning formula, I think that will be a real challenge.
I have a couple more, and then I want to open it up to the audience. But one I'm particularly interested in hearing is how the Trump administration should be engaging Europe on these issues. So Ambassador Bolton has said he thinks the days of multilateral sanctions are over. So what does that leave? What are the important topics on which we ought to be engaging Europe. Senator, any thoughts on that?
The big idea that I worked on was how to bring China on our side. When you talk about Iran, the Chinese leadership, when I was running the China Working Group here, glaze over and they think, oh, the Americans want us to trigger another recession here in China here. You have to understand 11% of China's energy needs come from Iran. And I would explain, hey, they are not a stable energy provider. If they get involved in a war in the Persian Gulf as they did, they could not be a stable provider. Then I said, to shift the entire discussion into a positive direction, you need to talk about a multilateral development of a Chinese energy development facility from Central Asia to connect Saudi Arabia directly to China. And if you can walk into the Politburo and say, I want to meet your 11% energy need to make sure it is able to be delivered to China regardless of military situation. By running the energy from Saudi Arabia directly to China, you would run it through areas that are likely to be not interrupted. At that point, the whole discussion becomes a very positive discussion in Beijing. I think if you can bring China on side, you'll bring a lot of Europe on board, because China being the super heavyweight now of diplomacy these days. You need to have a productive and open-ended discussion outside the box to bring China on side and make sure you're talking to them in ways they have guaranteed access to that 11% energy. And the Chinese Communist Party does not look at a future recession, which could destabilize them in a Romanian kind of way, which is the number one fear that they have. You got to make sure that fear is not part of our Iran ask.
Well, that's right, to recognize the centrality of energy security issues. Very important. Steve?
Well, first, let me just say a word about multilateral sanctions, the multilateral sanctions that were applied against Iran. They were quite a success, and it was really an amazing accomplishment. And so I'm proud to be seated next to the then senator, who probably more than anyone else, with the possible exception of Senator Menendez, is personally responsible for getting us to getting the multilateral sanctions regime to where it ultimately got. It was really an amazing accomplishment. I think before the U.S. government went down that road, a lot of people predicted it couldn't possibly succeed, that economic interests would ensure that the Europeans would never cooperate with the United States on imposing these kinds of sanctions on Iran. And these were unbelievably creative sanctions. The financial sanctions, which in effect kind of imposed an oil export limitation on Iran, but not by actually limiting their oil exports, but rather by tying up the proceeds in central banks around the world. Really, incredibly creative, incredibly successful. I give the Obama administration a lot of credit for the way they implemented them, but we should not forget that when Senator Kirk and Senator Menendez first proposed this idea, the position of the Obama administration was, hell no, we completely oppose this approach. It will never work. Don't do this. We oppose this legislation. Fortunately, Congress persevered over the Obama.
There was more hell no and the horse you rode in on.
Yeah. So, I mean, not a very glorious start on the part of the Obama administration, but once the Congress worked its will, I will give them credit that they did effectively get us to a place where the sanctions had pretty serious bite on the Iranians, and it would be nice to get back to that point in a post-JCPOA world. Ambassador Bolton may be right that it's impossible. Theresa May was here a week or so ago. I'm sure one of her first talking points was, do not abandon the JCPOA, and by the way, if you do abandon it, don't assume that we're going to be on board with reimposing multilateral sanctions. I imagine they're hearing that from every European government, and it's got to be a sobering thing, because if it's true, it limits options that exist going forward. But I guess I think the Obama administration was hearing those same words back when it was saying to Senator Kirk, these sanctions will be enacted over our dead body. And in the end, through the determination of the Congress and adept or adroit U.S. diplomacy, the Europeans did come around. So I guess maybe I'm not quite as pessimistic as Secretary Bolton. I think it probably depends in part on how things play out, how what the events are that lead to the question of reimposing sanctions.
Okay, well, last question for me, and then I'll open it up. We have several Iranian Americans in the audience, and I would love your views on how all of this plays into Iranian domestic politics leading up to the election in Iran.
I'll take that a little bit.
Yeah.
In a regime like Iran, opposition by the United States is a central pillar of the regime, like the North Korean regime. I worry as we get into some tussles and conflict, it's actually strengthened the regime from a nationalist viewpoint. I remember polling when the Iranians allowed a poll, and the question went out to Iranian voters: do you think, like the Americans say, that our government is a state sponsor of terror? The answer came back 50-50, so they shut down the polling company. It indicates to me that when we heard about how many young people there were, Iran is the most internet connected, more blogs per capita than any other country in the Middle East. That is a reserve of support that we could have for us. And we need to make sure that we keep the Iranian young people on our side, which is why I don't think if a green revolution emerges, that because Obama was into appeasement of Iran, he would definitely undercut the opposition to the regime. I think that Trump, if he supported the regime, the opposition to the regime, we need Radio Farda and make sure that we get direct broadcast of news media into Iran to make sure the U.S.-Iranian community can generate content that's meaningful and get that into the country. I think through the various holes, the internet is so attractive, we can get the young people on our side. And for the Iranian regime wanting to tie themselves to a version of the 7th century is not successful in the 21st century. That's an easy case to make.
Steve, anything to add?
Okay, well, I don't hold myself out as an expert on Iranian politics, but I'll make the observation that I think our nation has embarrassed itself on more than one occasion by thinking that it could pursue a series of policies that would elevate the Iranian moderates over the hardliners and somehow lead to better foreign policy outcomes for us. And that's not just a comment about the last administration or the one before it, but really going back to the time of the Iranian Revolution. And so I think we flatter ourselves if we think that we can calibrate our policies here in a way that are going to lead to better political outcomes in Iranian elections. And I think we ought to just not focus on that question, because if we do, we're likely to get it wrong. Instead, we should focus on what's in our interest and proceed in that manner. And the Iranian politics will sort itself out, and that's going to happen irrespective of what we do.
Let me add on to what Steve just said. The one thing that I've been looking at from the wider public is a list of the gay Iranians have been executed by the regime. It's about 1,000 names long. We never were able to get pictures of and names of everybody who's been executed just for being gay in Iran. That's a good way to undermine support for the regime, not just in America and also in Europe. Make sure that this policy of executing homosexual Iranians is, I would say, one of the saddest pictures I ever saw was a crane that I thought was made by Caterpillar in Peoria, Illinois, with an Iranian gay person hanging from it. Want to make sure that that is a crystalline part of our knowledge base. I would say to the wider human rights community, we need that list of young Iranian gay people who have been executed by the regime simply for being gay.
My name is Farman Kali. I'm from the New Iran organization in California. And Honorable Kirk, dovetailing in what you just said about the oppressive measures that kind of put down the voices of dissent and how deplorable the situation, the human rights situation is in Iran. I want to just take us for a second, dive deeper in where international community in 1960s and 70s embraced a secular Iran, and we called it the island of stability, and we basically impeded to sell nuclear technology to Iran because of the trust and the strong relationship. So if we take that and now understand what is in the DNA of Ayatollahs, which is living in chaos, living in crisis, and that's how they survive. Just like Mr. Castro, we just constantly brewing this very negative energy into our environment. So, but there is a global community. There are 7 million Iranians who are all thriving to have improved relationships. I caution all the voices who are beating the drums of war. There is an alternative. There is a real alternative that are struggling to find you and shake your hand and solidify that relationship, the founding vision of America. What do you have to say about finding the voices of democratic society in Iran, the organizations who are underground in prisons and not being exposed to the world?
Great, why don't you take on that question?
I would say that one program that I had before I left here was to get each senator to adopt an Iranian prisoner of conscience and to make sure that we could understand, like we did with Soviet Jewry when we actually stared down the Soviet Union and won that battle. That for my top case, a human rights lawyer, mother of 2, she was locked up in Evin prison. I was going to finance out of my campaign posters to plaster all over New York City on Rouhani's visit to the UN, and he knew that was coming, and so he released my prisoner of conscience. So pressure can actually, you got to nail it down to one sympathetic figure. We had her name, her kids, her charges, what happened to her in Evin prison, and to make the story come alive to Western press. You do that case by case, reporter by reporter. That takes a long time.
Hi, Senator, great admirer of yours, but I've got a question I've never understood. Why was the bill that you and Senator Menendez introduced, why did it require 2/3 in both houses to reject rather than a simple majority to accept the agreement?
We were trying to overcome a presidential veto because we had a veto threat against us. To overcome a presidential veto in legislation, you're going to need 2/3 of the Senate and House. The key breakpoint was, I think the reason why the president went ahead and embraced more sanctions, President Obama, that we had reached that 2/3 point in both the House and the Senate. And once you got veto override, you got a lot of juice. That's it.
I'm sorry, could I just, was your question about the mechanism by which Congress reviewed the Iran deal? Yeah, so that was not Senator Kirk's legislation, that was Senator Corker's
That's right, yeah.
legislation. And but the answer largely applies. It was pretty clear at the time, I think, that President Obama would have vetoed anything that imposed a review mechanism that provided for acceptance or rejection of the deal based on a majority vote, because he was concerned, and rightly so, as it turned out, that he wouldn't.
We had the majority.
Yeah, that he wouldn't be able to get a majority, and so the 2/3 mechanism was the one that he was prepared to accept, because of course if he lost 2/3 of both houses, even without a mechanism, Congress could enact legislation to overturn his deal. So agreeing to legislation that required a 2/3 vote to overturn it really didn't change anything for him. Senator Corker's taken a lot of criticism for that mechanism, because a lot of people ask, as I think you're asking, why would Congress have so foolishly agreed that they would need a 2/3 majority to overturn the deal? And the first answer to that is they wouldn't have been able to enact anything other than that. But then you could still ask, well, then why did you enact? And I sometimes wondered, why did they enact something that enables the president at the end of the day to say, Congress reviewed my agreement and decided to let it come into force, which was the talking point that he had at the end of that review. I think the answer that I've heard Senator Corker and his people offer is, at least there was a structured debate in the Congress about the deal under their legislation. And had there been no such legislation, it's possible that there really wouldn't have been much of a debate at all, because the president would have just proceeded to implement the deal on his own authority, and Congress could have tried to race after him with legislation. But if you watched how it played out, as it became clear that a two-thirds majority was not going to be found in either house to overturn the deal, both houses did vote, but a lot of the energy dissipated as members realized they really didn't have the ability to block the deal. Yeah, and if you look at the rationalization that some of the Democrats who were clearly uncomfortable voting for the deal, the rationalization they offered was, well, the UN's already, our hands are tied. If we back away now, it'll be even worse. The sanctions are gone.
Kevin Winston again. First, thanks very much for this great panel and all the panelists today. And Senator Kirk, an old shipmate from the Navy, I want to thank you very much, sir, for your service in the Navy, your service to the country in the Senate, and your leadership in all these different issues. Two quick questions. One, I don't know if you all have met with Jason Rezaian. He was a Washington Post reporter that was imprisoned in Iran for 200-something days, and other groups like that, so that we can maybe get the media. And then, of course, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Get them on board to help from the media, along with your idea and your point about the gay people who have been killed in Iran. And then the second question is, the people that, one of the fears I always have is, since we gave back $1-point-something billion, the people that were involved in this negotiation from the U.S. side on many levels, is there anything that your colleagues, former colleagues in the Senate could do and the Congress could do to prevent people from benefiting, right? From, I'm now the lobbyist for Iran and I'm giving speeches and so forth, because I could see some of that money eventually filtering back to certain people, and I wonder about that. So the media side with Jason Rezaian, and then also precluding people from benefiting. Thank you.
I think the Iranians eventually agreed that locking up the Washington Post guy was a way to really piss off the East Coast media in America and put them on the anti-Iranian side. And with regard to the future, when we look at prisoners that we can get out, it's merely a factor of how much we can publicize them. Rezaian hit that critical point where we could, and I would say the one thing that I think the Congress should do is to make sure that it still has power of the purse. The administration used a loophole in U.S. law using the settlements fund, whereby the executive could settle lawsuits against the United States, basically without a need for appropriation by the Congress. That's where all the ransom money came from. That loophole should be closed. I don't see President Trump ever paying ransom, and so I don't think there's a danger of the Congress losing its power there under this administration. But under the previous administration, that loophole definitely needed to be closed.
The bear in the room between in the Persian Gulf today is Saudi Arabia and the looming conflict or potential conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the potential for military conflict between the two. The Saudis have stepped up their presence in Syria. Apparently, the Saudi king had a conversation with President Trump where he pledged to fund safe zones in Syria to keep Syrian refugees in the region instead of bringing them up to Europe, which signals that there could be a closer cooperation with the United States. Given what this president said during the campaign about not engaging in foreign conflicts, not engaging in nation building, putting America first, and using our allies, if you wish, as partners in places like Syria and the Persian Gulf, do you see that we could actually get closer to a shooting war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and potentially a nuclear war between Saudi and Iran?
Saudi doesn't have nuclear weapons. I don't see them.
Remember Japan, how many screws away they might be? I mean, we don't know how many screws away the Saudis might.
I always worried that the PAC nuclear arsenal was for rent, that the Saudis could always call for a couple of devices to come over, making a Saudi nuclear power overnight. So the idea of PAC devices coming over and being immediately used in a conflict, I think it has a low probability. But we're already in a shooting war. I will refer to my shipmate Wensing. When I saw that video of the Medina, the Saudi ship that was recently hit, you see the fast mover, basically a ship IED coming in, and in the foreground is a helicopter, which one Navy wag said is a very expensive lawn chair. And I would have said to the Saudis, hey, why is a helicopter on the deck when it could be out shooting at the fast mover coming to blow your ship up? Just seemed like basic seamanship was lacking there in that attack. When a frigate like that can take a hit from a fast mover like that, when she has plenty of weaponry that could blow that incoming threat. Seemed like that was not competently run there. And over time, I will say strategically, I'll tell you a story. A while ago, I asked for the Saudi ambassador to come in here for lunch, Jubair Ali. Many of you might have met him. I said recent communications intercepts that have been released show that the Iranians wanted you dead, Jubair. I said, when I read the transcript of what they were saying, they wanted to kill you at Cafe Milano in Georgetown, about 4 blocks from where I lived. And I said, Jubair, why do they want to kill you at Cafe Milano? In the transcript, I saw they said could they even get some congressmen and senators. That kind of pisses us off. He said, Mark, all of us wealthy Saudis usually have a hobby. My hobby is cooking. And I have a friend at Cafe Milano that's sometimes the chief chef there. And so the Iranians found out sometimes I volunteered there, and so they wanted to blow the place up. And that story reminded me that the Saudis will probably do almost anything to screw the Iranians, that we have a very, very good ally there to be able to adjust production to undercut the Iranian position in the oil market, and even have Israeli aircraft refueled on desert highways somewhere in Saudi so they can appear over targets if they should decide to hit Iran with plenty of gas aboard. I would think the Saudis would be able to help with that because there's no love lost there. And Jubair is now their foreign minister. He's gone up in the world. So I see a lot of Saudi cooperation with us on this whole field.
Can you pull up on this pointer whether you think the Saudis are likely to try to follow suit?
Well, of course, if you ask any non-proliferation expert over the last 20 years, what was the biggest concern about the Iran nuclear program? They'd say, of course, Iran with nuclear weapons is threatening, but actually, if Iran succeeds in getting a nuclear weapon, this was the experts' prediction, this will lead to the unraveling of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because there will be a cascade of proliferation. That other countries that feel threatened by the Iranian nuclear weapon will decide that they need nuclear weapons too. And that, eventually, the upshot of that will be to basically unravel the entire Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which limits the number of countries that can have nuclear weapons. I guess the good news is that, well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the JCPOA does diminish the threat that in the near term Iran is going to get a nuclear weapon, because for a period of about 10 years it scales back, not so much their capabilities, but it scales back the materials they're allowed to possess, which they could use to quickly put together a nuclear weapon. After 10 years, and this is the really bad news, after 10 years, the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon increases exponentially. And that's not just my opinion. I mean, President Obama was quoted saying, the great thing about this deal was today, his claim was that Iran had a 30-day breakout window. That's how long it would take them to produce one nuclear weapon. And under the deal, they'd increased that to 1 year. But he admitted, I guess it was a radio interview, that after about year 13, the breakout time reduces to 0. And as John Bolton said, in the future, the breakout's not going to be about producing one weapon. It's going to be about announcing that suddenly they have dozens of nuclear weapons. And that's what the JCPOA locks in, a future where that risk is omnipresent. And so, I think your question goes to the Saudi reaction. Obviously, they were very, very unhappy with the JCPOA, and they've made their unhappiness clear. I'm sure President Trump's having to deal with that, just as he's hearing from Theresa May what a great deal this is. He's probably hearing from countries like Saudi Arabia about what a threatening deal this is. What Saudi Arabia ultimately will do, as we start approaching year 13, is anybody's guess. The Pakistan scenario has been discussed. I guess I will say, and this is just a factual observation, there had been some talk in the past coming out of Saudi Arabia about how they were going to, as has happened in the UAE, stand up a pretty robust civilian nuclear program. And if you look at what happened in Iran, that's kind of how it started. They claimed to be setting up a civilian program, and then it turned out there was other stuff going on behind the scenes but the civilian program gave them cover for lots of other things. The Saudis had been talking about that, but in recent years, their interest in a civilian nuclear program does seem to have fallen off. I don't see much evidence that they're now that we're only coming up on, I guess we're now into year 2 under the JCPOA, and President Obama tells us we don't really have to panic until year 13. But so maybe the Saudis have some time, but.
What percentage chance would you give of a shooting war, a conventional shooting war between the Saudis and Iran? I mean, they're almost there in Syria.
Well, in Yemen too. So.
I think we have time for one.
I mean, what you're seeing in Syria and Yemen is sort of proxy warfare. So you're.
Much more direct with the Iranian missile strikes on
I mean, it's certainly something you have to worry about. I guess I'm reluctant to assign probabilities to it. I think, my guess is the Saudis are not looking forward to such a conflict, and they're hoping that some changes occur in the region that diminish the threat.
We have time for one last one. How about in the back?
I have 2 questions, very quickly. The upcoming elections in Europe, Germany and France, do you see, because of what we've seen here in the U.S. and with Brexit, this political revolution, do you see anything happening with their new leaders that will be coming into office where our White House can work with them to get them more on board with reinstituting sanctions? And then on top of that, Trump's talking about doing one-on-one trade deals. Why can't we attach language to any potential trade deal with any European country that would have them need to be on board in order to trade with us?
The most interesting thing would be if Le Pen wins in France. I think we would have maybe an overeager partner really to kick some serious ISIS butt with us. To have the French military on board really helps build your European cohesion. That since they have an aircraft carrier and the Foreign Legion and foreign deployment capabilities, which we would probably have to provide for them, that if she becomes President Le Pen, I think would be a very, very active European partner with President Trump, just because of the way she is.
All right, well, thank you all very much, and thank you especially to our panelists for a great discussion. Just honored to be with you today, so thank you.
Kevin, I have a plan for you. It's called the Retired 06 Plan.